I have served the Moron court for 41 years. I have stood at the left edge of the throne hall dais through 3 succession crises, 2 interregnum petitions, 1 attempted coup that lasted exactly 9 hours before the palace guard ended it quietly in the lower corridors, and a diplomatic siege that went on for 11 months and resolved with a handshake that fooled no one and satisfied everyone. I have watched queens make decisions that moved fleets, watched advisors sharpen their blades on compliments, watched the careful machinery of dynasty grind through grief and ambition, and the long silences between wars. I have, over the course of 41 years, believed myself to be difficult to surprise. I was wrong about that, I know it now. I have been wrong about it since the 15th day of the Moron 3rd month, in the 42nd year of Queen Evrath Sel Moron's reign, when a human records keeper stood in the center of the throne hall and read 7 words from a dead language, and the most composed woman I have ever known forgot how to breathe. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me begin where the day began. The petition arrived, as most trouble does, in formal language that made it sound reasonable. Lord Claimant Dareth Vaughan had filed, through the proper channels of the Accord Registry, a challenge of vacancy under Article 19 of the Moron Succession Compact. The article itself was ancient. It had been invoked twice in the history of the dynasty, once in the reign of Queen Evrath's grandmother, and once before that, in a period so distant the records used a dating system no one fully understood anymore. Article 19 stated, in the dense ceremonial Moron standard phrasing that legal documents preferred, that if the reigning monarch held an unsealed bond register vacancy for a period exceeding 12 full dynasty years without formal designation, any lord of Moron blood and the 4th-tier lineage, or above, could file a petition for compact review. Compact review meant, in plain language, that the court would convene in full session, and the Queen would be required to either name a bond designation or permit the court to advance a candidate from among the petitioners. 12 years. The Queen's bond register had been vacant for 12 years, 3 months, and some days I had stopped counting. Her consort, Lord Sel Moron, a quiet, careful man who had loved her with the kind of love that doesn't announce itself and so is only visible in retrospect, had died in the 14th year of her reign. A transport accident. The kind of death that has no meaning, no weight, no lesson to offer. He was there and then he was not, and the Queen had sealed the bond register the morning after his funeral rites and had not reopened it since. I had been there for the sealing. I had been standing in this same hall, at this same left edge of the dais, watching her sign the document with steady hands. Her face had been composed. Her eyes had been the color of seafoam in winter light, pale and distant, and she had not cried, not in front of the court. She had thanked me formally, and I had bowed formally, and neither of us had mentioned that the thing she had just signed was the paperwork of a woman who intended to grieve for the rest of her life. I had known Sel Moron. Not well, he was not a man who cultivated large acquaintances, but enough to understand what he had been to her. He had come to the bondrite from a minor branch of an allied house, not the obvious choice, not the politically advantageous one, and the court at the time had muttered about it the way courts mutter about everything they do not control. He was quiet. He read extensively and walked in the palace gardens in the early mornings, and had the habit, which the court found peculiar and which I found quietly admirable, of speaking to the record staff and the kitchen staff and the maintenance staff by name, with the easy directness of a man who had simply never learned to treat people differently based on what they did. He had never been demonstrative in public. He and the Queen had conducted their bond in the Moron fashion of their generation, which is to say with dignity and restraint, and the understanding that the important things happened in the rooms the court could not see. What the court could see was that she was, in the years of his presence, a different kind of steady. Not softer, she was never soft. It is not in her, but with a quality underneath the composure that was less like endurance and more like rest. When he died, that quality went with him. I had watched her in the months after, watched the queen who had always been composed become a woman who was composed in a different and more costly way, the way of someone who is spending a resource they have a finite supply of. She never showed it publicly. She was impeccable every session, every audience, every reception and formal dinner and state occasion. But I was at the left edge of the dais for all of it, and I know what I saw. The bond register sealing had been 1 week after the funeral rites. She had done it efficiently, as she did everything, and she had not discussed it with me beforehand and had not invited discussion afterward. I respected her for it. I have never stopped respecting her for it, and I had also spent 12 years aware that there was a difference between respecting a decision and believing it had no cost. But Dareth Vaughan was not a man who respected things. He was a man who measured them and found the soft places where they could be pressed. He had fourth-tier Moron lineage through his mother's line, which gave him standing, and he had spent the last several years cultivating alliances among the court's younger factions, the ones who had grown up after Vine's death and had no memory of what the queen had been before the vacancy, only the practical inconvenience of the succession question. He was not stupid, and he was not cruel in any obvious way. He was simply ambitious in the particular manner of a man who has identified a gap and decided it is his. I had disliked him on principle since the first time he visited court. This is not relevant to what happened. I mention it because I want to be honest about my own position. I was not a neutral observer on the day of the petition hearing. I wanted it to fail. What I did not anticipate was how it would fail, or at whose hands. The throne hall of Moron Palace is not a subtle room. It was built to communicate something specific, and it does so without apology. The ceiling vaults 40 feet overhead in a series of interlocked arches, each faced with pale stone cut from the Moron Ridge quarries, and inlaid with thin lines of dark copper that trace the genealogy of the dynasty in a script so fine it requires a special glass to read. The floor is black granite, polished to a mirror surface, so that when the hall is full of people you see two courts, the real one above and the reflected one below, inverted and slightly wrong, which I have always thought was the most honest architectural statement I have ever encountered. At the far end, elevated on 3 steps of the same black granite, the throne sits, not the ornate carved thing that most people imagine when they think of thrones, but a simple seat of pale stone with a high back and arms worn smooth by generations of hands. It is a working throne. It looks like it has been used. Queen Evrath was already seated when I took my position on the dais. She wore the formal deep blue of the Moron state sessions, a long coat with the dynasty mark at the collar, her black hair coiled and pinned with a single silver cord, no jewelry except the bond seal ring on her right hand that she had worn since Vine's death and never removed. She was 63 years old, which placed her in the middle era of Moron life, and she looked, as she always looked, like a woman who had made peace with every difficulty except one, and was managing the exception with dignity. Her hands rested on the throne's arms. Her face was still. I had my notes. I did not look at them. I watched the hall. Dareth Vaughan arrived with the full ceremony he felt his petition entitled him to, an escort of 6 in Vaughan colors, his own legal advocate beside him, the petition documents in a sealed case carried by a young aide who looked faintly mortified by the circumstances. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the particular confidence of someone who has rehearsed the moment he is walking into. He bowed at the required depth and took the petitioner's floor position and did not look at me at all, which was correct protocol, and also told me everything about his read of the room. He did not think I mattered today. I thought about that. The Queen's first voice called the session to formal order. The petition was read aloud, all of it, the full Article 19 text, which took 11 minutes. I watched the court arrange itself into its usual topology of loyalty and ambiguity. There were faces I recognized. Lord Advocate Sen, who would rule procedurally on any challenges, Lady Councillor Threv, who had no opinion on the petition itself but several on Dareth Vaughan's precedent, the young Tribune Varath, who had come in with Vaughan's faction and was trying not to look like he had, old Councillor Maveth, who had served here almost as long as I had and who met my eyes briefly across the hall with an expression that conveyed, efficiently, her opinion of the entire proceedings. And at the side of the hall, in the outer corridor where the record staff had positioned themselves for the session, I saw Torvald Kane. He was standing with a document case under one arm and a handheld reference frame in the other, wearing the plain gray of the records division, and he was watching the petition reading with the mild, patient attention of a man who had been told he might be called, and was therefore paying attention, but was not himself particularly invested in the outcome. He was 43 years old, which I knew because I had filed his commission extension myself twice, and he had a long face, a graying beard kept short, and the particular posture of someone who has spent a great deal of time in rooms where he was not the most important person, not uncomfortable with it, not resentful of it, simply adjusted to it. He had worked in the Moron Palace Records Division for 12 years. In 12 years I had spoken to him perhaps 40 times on matters of filing. He was efficient, careful, and quiet. He had never given me reason to think about him further. I had noticed him in the way you notice furniture that is always in the same place and has always served its function reliably, which is to say that I had not really noticed him at all. He had been part of the palace for long enough that he had become part of the palace's texture, one of the dozens of quiet figures who move through the outer corridors and the administrative wings and the records halls, and who make the institution function without anyone particularly registering that they are doing so. The court noticed the senior advisors, the counselors, the diplomatic delegates, the high clerks. The records division occupied a different stratum, present and necessary and essentially invisible. I would later find this fact significant. I did not, in the moment, find it anything at all. I did not think about him further just then. I turned my attention back to the petition. The formal procedure of a compact review petition requires that anyone holding a standing commission at court be available to provide testimony on the nature of their commission and its validity. This is one of the older provisions in Moron law, and it applies broadly. Standing commission is defined as any formal assignment of 2 years or more, which encompasses everyone from senior advisors to the maintenance staff who maintain multi-year contracts. The provision exists because, historically, a compact review could be used to quietly purge the court of inconvenient personnel by challenging their commission standing, and the counter-provision was that everyone with standing commission would have an opportunity to formally register and defend it. In practice, for most sessions, this part of the procedure is handled quickly. Commissions are presented in writing and acknowledged in batch. The verbal registration is reserved for commissions that have been challenged by the petitioning party. Dareth Vaughan had challenged 7 commissions. 6 of them were, I suspected, theater, minor figures whose presence at court could be questioned on procedural grounds, filed to make the 7th challenge look like routine administrative scrutiny rather than what it actually was. The 7th was the Queen's senior bondrite advisor, a ceremonial position that had been filled by a Moron scholar named Councillor Reth Een for the past 8 years. Challenging his commission was Vaughan's method of removing the court's most authoritative voice on bondrite law before the Queen could invoke it defensively. It was not a subtle move, but it did not need to be. It only needed to work. What I did not know, and what Vaughan apparently did not know either, was that Torvald Kane's Records Division Commission had been flagged as one of the 6 theater challenges. I learned this when the first voice began calling the challenged commissions to floor registration, and Torvald's name came up third. I watched him walk from the outer corridor into the throne hall with the same mild patience he had shown while waiting. He did not look nervous. He did not look particularly anything. He walked to the center of the hall, the floor position designated for commission registrants, and stood with his document case and his reference frame, and waited for the first voice to direct him. Records Division Senior Keeper Torvald Kane, the first voice said. Commission of Formal Archive Maintenance, Moron Palace Records. Will you state your commission standing for the court's record? I will, Torvald said. His voice was a quiet baritone level, carrying in the way that voices carry in rooms with good acoustics when you're not trying to project. My commission was issued in the 9th year of Queen Evrath's 42nd regnant cycle under the Moron Accord Joint Records Compact, Formal Archive Standing, Palace Division. I have served continuously since commissioning. The commission renewal was processed and sealed in the standard form in both the 21st and 33rd year intervals. I hold the original document and both renewals. Present the original commission, the first voice said. Torvald opened the document case and removed a sealed document, original Moron standard, I could tell from the color of the seal band, and handed it to the floor aide, who carried it to the first voice's table for examination. Standard procedure. I noted Vaughn's legal advocate glance at the document and then glance away, and I understood. The challenge was procedural theater. The commission was clean. This would take 3 minutes and resolve to nothing. The first voice reviewed the document, made a notation. Commission standing is confirmed for presentation. Registrant is required to complete formal declaration per Article 12, Section 4 of the Compact Review Procedure. She looked at Torvald. Please read aloud the formal preamble of your commission as printed. I had not thought about the formal preamble in years. Most commissions printed it as boilerplate, a standard block of Moron standard legal language at the head of the document, confirming the issuing authority, the terms, and the ceremonial acknowledgement of the commission holder's duty to the dynasty. It was not meaningful language. It was the paperwork equivalent of a signature block, present on every commission document issued by the Moron Palace in the standard form going back approximately 300 years. Torvald opened the document the aide returned to him. He found the preamble. He began to read. The first several lines were the standard issuing language, the Accord Joint Compact reference numbers, the division designation, the formal date in the Moron long calendar style that took up an entire line because it included the dynasty year, the cycle, the month, the day, and the regnant notation. He read these correctly and without particular emphasis, following the text, the way anyone reads boilerplate they have seen before and know to be unimportant. And then he reached the end of the preamble. Every Moron Palace commission issued in the standard form closes its formal preamble with 7 words in the old Moron bond tongue, the ceremonial language of the dynasty's founding era, which predates the current Moron standard by approximately 6 centuries, and which, in living practice, is spoken fluently by perhaps a dozen scholars and understood at a reading level by perhaps 40. The 7 words are a formality. They have appeared on commission documents for 300 years as a preserved ceremonial closing, a piece of tradition that survived because no one ever updated the standard form, and they mean, roughly translated, something like, in service to the seat of the bond, in the name of the holder, with the fidelity of the sworn. No one who reads them aloud at a commission registration thinks about what they mean. No records keeper receiving a commission document is briefed on the old bond tongue. The words are there, they have always been there, and in 3 centuries of commissions and reviews and formal registrations, no one has ever read them aloud in this hall with any awareness of what they actually are. I did not think about what they were, listening to Torvald read. I was watching Vaughn's advocate, noting his lack of objection, calculating how quickly this would move to the next challenge. I was not watching the Queen. I was not watching the Queen when Torvald reached the 7 words and read them. He read them the way he had read everything else, carefully, following the text, attempting the pronunciation with the particular effort of someone encountering unfamiliar syllables and doing his best. He had seen the words before, presumably on his own commissioned document. He may have looked them up at some point over 12 years out of mild curiosity, or he may simply have a good ear for phonetics. I don't know. I will probably never know, and the not knowing is something I have accepted. What I know is how they sounded. They sounded correct. Not approximately correct. Not close enough. Correct. The stress on the third syllable of the second word, which shifts the meaning from formal acknowledgement to personal declaration. The elision between the fourth and fifth words that creates the Bond tongue's distinctive rhythmic pattern, the one that scholars argue about in papers I have read in the small hours when I cannot sleep. The falling cadence on the final word, which in the old Bond tongue is the grammatical marker that closes a vow rather than a statement. Torvald read 7 words in a dead ceremonial language from a boilerplate document, and he read them the way a bonded consort speaks them at the completion of the Aelketh oath. I became aware that the room had gone quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of people paying attention. Something different. The held quality of a room that has just heard something it does not have a frame for and is waiting for someone to provide one. I looked at the Queen. I have, in 41 years of service, seen Queen Evrath Selmoran face the death of her consort, an attempted coup, a succession crisis, a diplomatic siege, a flood that damaged the lower palace, and the slow grinding of 12 years of political pressure on the matter of the bond register. I have seen her compose herself in the seconds before addressing a hostile court. I have seen her hold her voice steady while announcing the death of a friend. I have seen her, in private, lower her head and breathe, and then raise it again with her face cleared, the way a woman who has practiced grief learns to surface from it cleanly. Her hand was at her mouth, not pressed there in the way of someone suppressing sound, raised there slowly, fingers curved, palms slightly cupped, the gesture of someone whose body has responded before her mind caught up. Her eyes were open and fixed on Torvald Kane with an expression I had never seen on her face in 41 years, and I found I did not have a name for it in any of the languages I know. It was not shock exactly. It was not grief. It was something further back than either of those things, something that lives in the place before a person has decided what they feel, the raw moment of recognition before the self has organized the information. Her eyes were very bright. She was not crying. She was not going to cry, not here, not in front of the court. She is not that kind of woman, and this was not that kind of moment. It was something quieter and more interior, a thing that was happening in a register the court could not quite see but could feel the pressure of, the way you feel weather changing before it changes. Her hand stayed at her mouth. She breathed. I do not know how long the silence lasted. In the way of significant silences, it felt much longer than it was. Let me tell you what the Aelketh oath is, because I realize I have been assuming knowledge that most people in that room did not have. The Aelketh is the bond-right oath of the Moron dynasty's founding compact. It is, historically, the oath spoken by a bond match at the moment of the bond-right sealing, the 7-word declaration of fidelity and service that, in the old ceremonial practice, completed the bond and made the match legally irrevocable under Moron succession law. It is not a romantic oath in the popular sense. It is a constitutional oath. It is the oath that says, I am the one who stands at this seat, I am the one who holds this house, I am the one who swore to remain. The Moron bondrite has not been performed in its full ceremonial form in 300 years. The modern succession compact replaced it with written registry and formal designation, but the old provisions survived in the legal code because Moron law does not repeal things, it layers. And under the old provisions, which have never been formally stricken, the Aelketh oath spoken voluntarily by a person in the presence of the reigning sovereign constitutes a formal bond claim, regardless of species, regardless of lineage, regardless of any other consideration. The old law did not restrict bond claims by blood. It only required the oath and the sovereign's responding phrase. Councillor Reth Een would have known this, The Queen knew this. I knew this, though I had not thought of it in active terms in years. It was the kind of legal trivia that lives in the corners of your knowledge, present but unaccessed, because it has not been relevant in several centuries. I do not believe Torvald Kane knew this. I am nearly certain he did not know this. I am nearly certain he reached the end of the preamble, found the 7 words he had presumably seen before on his own commissioned document, and read them carefully and correctly because he is a careful and correct person, and that the thunderclap that went through the room was entirely invisible to him, because he did not know what he had just said. He lowered the document. He looked up. The room was still not moving. He looked at the first voice, who had not made a notation, and whose stylus was hovering an inch above her records tablet without touching it. He looked at Lord Advocate Sen, who had gone a color I can only describe as the color of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the morning. He looked at Councillor Maveth, who was looking at the Queen. He looked at Dareth Vaughan, who was looking at Torvald with an expression that was working very hard to be unreadable and not quite succeeding. There was something behind it, something that understood, with the terrible clarity of a man watching his careful strategy, encounter an obstacle that does not appear in any of his plans. Then Torvald looked at the Queen. I watched him look at her. I watched him register the stillness of the room, the quality of the silence, the hand at her mouth, the brightness in her eyes. I watched him try to assemble these things into a meaning and fail, because he did not have the peace he needed, and the peace was 300 years old and buried in a legal code he had never had reason to open. He looked for a moment, like a man who has said something without knowing what he said and is waiting, with patient bewilderment, for someone to explain the consequence. He did not look frightened. I want to note that. I was watching him carefully and he was not frightened. He was confused and he was still, and his hands were at his sides with the document case held loosely. The posture of someone who has stopped moving, because the room has stopped moving, and he is waiting to understand why, without panic, with the particular steadiness of a man who has learned, somewhere along the way, that waiting to understand is better than acting before you do. I have thought about that steadiness since. I have thought about it quite a lot. The Queen lowered her hand. The motion was deliberate and slow, the way she does everything in formal session, every motion considered, every gesture chosen. She lowered her hand and she placed it on the arm of the throne, and she took a breath that was visible to me from where I stood because I was watching for it, and she straightened very slightly, the fractional adjustment of a woman settling into a decision she has made. The throne hall of Moron Palace is 40 feet at the vault, and it holds, at full session, approximately 200 people. In the moment before the Queen spoke, 200 people were completely silent. I have been in this room for hundreds of formal sessions, and I do not believe I have ever heard it that quiet. "Records Keeper Kane," the Queen said. Her voice was level. It was the voice she uses in state sessions, formal, clear, carrying exactly to the back of the hall. There was something underneath it that the formal register almost concealed. I heard it because I have been listening to her voice for 41 years, and I know its frequencies the way you know the sound of something that has been part of your days for so long you have stopped being conscious of it, until one day it changes, and the change is the most obvious thing in the world. Underneath the formal register, she sounded like a woman trying to hold something very large and very old with steady hands. "Yes, Your Grace," Torvald said, still patient, still bewildered I thought, but patient. "You read the formal preamble of your commission," she said. "I did, Your Grace, as directed by the first voice." "Including the final declaration." "Yes, Your Grace," a brief pause. "I have read it before, on the original document when it was issued. I looked up the words at the time." Another pause, shorter. "I wanted to be able to pronounce them correctly if they were ever required at review." Something moved across the Queen's face. It was there and gone in a moment, and I could not name it either, but it was not a small thing. The idea that he had spent 12 years occasionally thinking about those 7 words, making sure he could pronounce them correctly in case he was ever required to read them aloud. Not because he knew what they meant in the way that mattered, but because he is the kind of man who prepares for the thing that might be asked of him. I watched that idea land somewhere in her and find a place and stay there. "You read them correctly," she said. "I tried to, Your Grace. I hoped I had." The silence again, 200 people not breathing. The Queen looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were still very bright. She had not looked away from him since he had read the words, and I do not think she was going to, not yet, not until this was finished in one direction or another. "You understand," she said, "that there is a formal procedure associated with those words, under the old compact." Torvald was quiet for a moment. "I didn't, Your Grace," he said. "I don't believe I knew that." "No," she said, "I don't believe you did." Something in her voice had shifted. The formal register was still there, but underneath it the thing I had heard earlier was closer to the surface now, less concealed. The old compact provides that those words, spoken voluntarily in the presence of the reigning sovereign, constitute a formal declaration under the Aelketh bond right. The declaration is not binding without the responding phrase. She paused. No one has spoken those words in this hall in 300 years. I watched Torvald absorb this. I watched him sit with it carefully, the way he would sit with a document he needed to understand before acting on it. His face did not change dramatically. He is not a dramatic man, but his stillness deepened slightly, the way stillness does when something significant has just been set down in front of a person and they are deciding how to pick it up. "I see," he said, and then after a moment, "I'm sorry, Your Grace." "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," she said. Another pause. In that pause the entire hall held. "The declaration is made," the Queen said. "Under the old compact the sovereign may speak the responding phrase or decline it. The declining requires no ceremony. The acceptance," she stopped, started again. "The acceptance is irrevocable." Torvald said nothing. He was looking at her with the careful attention of a man listening to something important and making sure he understood it before responding. "I want to be clear," the Queen said, "about what I am about to do." Her voice was still level. Her hands were still on the arms of the throne, but something had changed in the quality of her stillness. It was no longer the stillness of a woman holding something at bay. It was the stillness of a woman who has made a decision and has, at last, stopped holding. "In 12 years," she said, "I have been given many reasons to open the bond register. Arguments of succession, arguments of alliance, arguments of political necessity, arguments of dynasty. I have found none of them sufficient." A pause. I did not expect to find sufficiency in a records keeper reading boilerplate from a commissioned document. The faintest thing crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Something that would become a smile eventually, I thought, when she was not standing in front of 200 people managing the most significant moment in 12 years with formal court protocol. "But I find that sufficiency is not always announced," she said. "Sometimes it walks in with a document case and reads what is asked of it and does not know what it has said. And that," her voice was still level, still formal. The brightness in her eyes was something I was going to be thinking about for the rest of my life. "That is, I believe, a form of answer I have not encountered before." She looked at him. He looked at her. 200 people looked at both of them. "Records keeper Kane," the Queen said, "I am going to speak the responding phrase of the Aelketh bond right. I am doing so in full knowledge of what I am doing and in full awareness of what it means under the old compact. I want you to understand that this is not a procedure being conducted without your awareness. You may object if you choose to. You may step back if you choose to. I will not require you to understand everything that has happened in this room today before you make that choice. I will only tell you that you are permitted to make it." Torvald was quiet for a moment. I was watching his face very carefully. "I'm not going to object, Your Grace," he said. "You don't know what it means," she said. "I know enough to understand that it means something," he said. "And I know," he stopped, seemed to reconsider the sentence, began again. "I've served in this court for 12 years. I've watched it from the outside of things most of the time. I know what vacancy looks like, and I know what it costs, and I think—" Another stop. He was a man who did not speak carelessly, and he was choosing each word carefully. I could see that, could see the slight pause before each phrase as he made sure it was the right one. "I think that if I have said something here today without knowing what I was saying, that is of some use to you, then I would rather you made use of it. That's all." The brightness in her eyes was very close to the surface now. "That's all," she repeated quietly, not mocking, something else entirely. "Yes, Your Grace." She was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke the responding phrase. The responding phrase of the Aelketh Bondrite is 6 words. I am not going to write them here. This is my record, my account of what happened in the throne hall on the 15th day of the Moron 3rd month, and I am choosing not to include the responding phrase in a document that may be read by people for whom those 6 words are merely a curiosity. They are not merely a curiosity. They are the 6 words that open a thing that was closed. They are the 6 words that say, "I hear you. I accept you. I have been waiting." She spoke them in the old Bond tongue, with the precise cadence and stress of the ceremonial form, in the voice she uses in state sessions, clear, formal, carrying to the back of the hall, and with the thing underneath it that I had been hearing all morning, the thing that was not grief and not shock and was not quite any emotion I had been trained to name, close to the surface now, no longer concealed, present in the hall the way weather is present when the season finally turns and you understand, stepping outside, that it has been coming for a long time. When she finished speaking, the hall was completely silent. Then Counselor Maveth, who has served this court almost as long as I have, and who has attended 3 compact reviews and 1 attempted coup, and does not give her reactions easily, said something under her breath that I believe was an oath in the old moron vernacular, the kind that is only used for moments of extreme and genuine feeling. I found I agreed with her entirely. What happened in the following minutes was the procedural business of an extraordinary session. The first voice, to her credit, recovered quickly. She has been first voice for 9 years, and she has seen a great deal, though I doubt she has seen this, and she moved through the immediate procedural steps with the focused professionalism of a woman who will absolutely be thinking about today for the rest of her life, but has chosen to do it later, after the court is settled. She called for a formal acknowledgement of the Aelketh Declaration and response. She noted the irrevocability per the old compact. She addressed, briefly and without editorializing, the matter of the Article 19 petition, which had, as she observed in formal language, been rendered procedurally moot by the events of the session. Dareth Vaughan left the hall. He did so correctly, observing all the forms, bowing at the required depth, collecting his advocate and his aide and his petition documents. He had the bearing of a man who is going to need some time alone to reorganize his understanding of how the day had gone. I watched him go without particular emotion. Whatever I had felt toward him before the session seemed now like a small and distant thing that had belonged to a different morning. Torvald stood in the center of the hall through all of this, still with the document case under his arm, still with the patience of a man who has learned to wait. The court moved around him, people speaking quietly to their neighbors, the procedural staff making notations, the small currents of a room processing something significant, and he stood in the middle of it and waited, because that seemed like the correct thing to do, and because he is, fundamentally, a man who knows when to wait. The Queen remained on the throne. When the procedural steps were completed and the first voice had called a formal recess, the hall began to empty. Slowly, because people wanted to stay, wanted to watch, wanted to be in the room for whatever came next. But the first voice's recess was not a suggestion, and the court dispersed, murmuring, into the corridors and the outer chambers, and the various places where the business of the next hour would be discussed in the urgent and slightly disbelieving tones of people who have just witnessed something. I did not leave. The Queen did not leave. Torvald did not leave. And Counselor Maveth did not leave, because she is 83 years old and has earned the right to stay in any room she chooses as long as she chooses, and also because she was watching this with the expression of a woman who has waited 40 years to see something like this, and is not going to miss the last of it for procedural courtesy. When the hall was emptied of everyone except the four of us and the two palace guards at the far door, the Queen came down the 3 steps from the dais. She had never, in 41 years that I can recall, come down from the dais in formal session without the session being formally closed. But this was not formal session anymore. It was something else, something that did not have a procedure, something that was being invented in the moment by a woman who has spent 41 years following procedures and knew today that the procedures had run out. She crossed the black granite floor toward the center of the hall. Torvald watched her come. He had not moved. His hands were at his sides now. At some point he had set down the document case and the reference frame, I noticed, on the floor beside him, not dramatically, just the practical act of a man who realized he would not need them for whatever came next. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he watched the Queen walk toward him, and he did not look frightened or overwhelmed or particularly anything except present, entirely present, in the way that some people are capable of being, and most people are not, the way of someone who has decided that this moment is what is happening, and he is going to be in it, not somewhere else. She stopped a few feet from him. They were approximately the same height, I noticed. I had never noticed that before. I had seen Torvald in this hall many times over 12 years, and I had never had reason to think about his height in relation to the Queen's, because I had never imagined them standing this close to each other in this context or any context. "You have served in this court for 12 years, the Queen said. "Yes, Your Grace." "And in 12 years, she said, you have filed records." "Yes, Your Grace, that's the job." Something about the plainness of it, "that's the job," made the corner of her mouth move. Still not a smile, not quite, but the territory adjacent to one. "I know," she said. "I've seen your filing, it's excellent." "Thank you, Your Grace." A pause. "I don't know," she said, "exactly what comes next. I want to be honest about that. There is a procedure for bond registration in the modern compact, which is what would normally govern from this point, but the modern compact was not what was invoked today, and I am not certain the old compact provides detailed guidance for the aftermath of a bond right in circumstances." She stopped. A breath. "In circumstances such as these." "I understand," Torvald said, and then, "I'm not in a hurry, Your Grace." The corner of her mouth moved again, further this time. "No," she said, "I don't suppose you are." She looked at him for a moment. The brightness was still in her eyes, steadier now, less pressured. "You said before that you would rather I made use of it, of what had happened. Of the declaration." "I did say that." "I want you to understand what you've agreed to," she said. "Not the legal form, the other thing." Torvald waited. "I have been closed," she said carefully, "for 12 years. I want you to know that. It was a choice I made and I do not regret making it. But I am aware that a person who has been closed for 12 years is not necessarily easy to," she stopped again, chose again, "not necessarily easy to know." "I've had 12 years of practice at patience," Torvald said. "I expect I have enough." This time it was a smile. Small, careful, the smile of a woman who has not smiled like this in front of another person in a long time and is remembering how. But it was real. I know a real smile on her face. I have not seen one in 12 years. "You'd better," she said. "I have been a court advisor for 41 years. In 41 years, I have written thousands of pages of assessments, analyses, recommendations, procedural notes, formal reports, and private memos. I have, in the course of that work, tried to maintain the discipline of accuracy, to say what happened, not what I wished had happened, and to note the limits of my own knowledge when those limits were relevant. I am noting them now. I do not know what Torvald Kane is, in the old compact's terms. I do not know whether it is possible for a person to carry something they do not know they carry, a set of words, a cadence, a stress pattern across 12 years of quiet service in a foreign court, and speak it at the exact moment it matters, without knowing what they are saying. I do not know whether the word for that is coincidence or something that the old compact scholars might have a more specific term for. I have been reading the old compact since that evening, and I have not found a satisfying answer, and I am beginning to think the old compact may not be interested in the question. What I know is what I saw. I saw a man read 7 words from a document he had been preparing to read correctly for 12 years, because he is the kind of man who prepares for the thing that might be asked of him, without knowing that preparing correctly for those 7 words meant something the document's writers had understood, and the commission's issuer had either known and not mentioned, or, more likely, I think, had not known either. Had simply copied the standard form from the standard form, before it going back 300 years. I saw a queen who had been closed for 12 years hear those 7 words in a voice that was not Veen's voice, and was not any voice she had been listening for, and I saw the thing that lived behind her composure, the thing I had been standing next to for 12 years without seeing, move to the surface of her face and stay there. I saw her come down from the dais. I have been a court advisor for 41 years, and I have served 6 queens and 2 regents and 1 acting sovereign during an interregnum, and I have believed myself, for most of those 41 years, to have seen the forms that history takes. The large forms, the battles and the treaties, the crises and the recoveries. And the small forms, the choice made in a corridor that determines the next decade, the word spoken in the wrong room at the wrong time that unravels a carefully constructed plan. I did not know, until the 15th day of the moron 3rd month, that history also takes this form. A quiet man with a document case who spent 12 years preparing to pronounce 7 words correctly, in case he was ever asked. I find I am grateful to have lived long enough to see it. In the weeks that followed, the court adjusted. Courts always adjust. They are organisms in a way. They respond to change the way organisms respond, by reorganizing around the new condition and finding a way to function within it. The Article 19 petition was formally withdrawn by Vaughan's advocate on the 3rd day after the session, in a document so brief and procedurally correct that it conveyed its author's feelings about the matter without saying a single word about them. The young Tribune Varath quietly realigned his allegiances, which surprised no one. Lady Councillor Threv issued a memo on the procedural precedent set by the session that was 22 pages long, and, I thought, rather brilliant, and which will probably be cited in moron legal scholarship for the next century. Councillor Maveth said nothing about any of it to anyone, as far as I could determine. This is her usual method. She has been saying nothing to anyone about things she has witnessed for 83 years, and it has served her well. The bond registration was completed under the modern compact on the 11th day, a procedure that in ordinary circumstances is bureaucratic and brief, and in these circumstances had the atmosphere of a very small and very private ceremony attended by the first voice, both senior advisors, and Councillor Maveth, who had been present at the original Aelketh declaration, and therefore had standing to witness the modern documentation as well. Torvald signed in the clear, careful handwriting of someone who works with documents for a living. The Queen signed in the formal style of the dynasty seal. The first voice countersigned and applied the registration mark. I countersigned as witnessing advisor. My handwriting, I noticed, was less steady than usual. I mentioned this to no one. Torvald did not change. This is the thing I keep returning to. The thing I keep wanting to document because I think it matters, and I am not certain anyone else in the court has articulated it clearly. He did not become someone different after the session. He was not transformed by it in the way of stories, did not suddenly occupy his space in the palace differently, did not acquire a new manner or a new register or a new awareness of himself as significant. He was, the day after and the week after and the month after, the same man he had been, patient, careful, quiet, attentive, doing the work that was in front of him. This was, I found, the quality the court had the most difficulty with. Courts are not designed for the unremarkable. They run on precedent and ceremony and the careful management of significance. And a man who had become, overnight, constitutionally significant but who was not behaving significantly provided them with very little to work with. The younger members of the court, the ones who understood the event mainly through its political implications, kept waiting for him to do something that announced his new position. He did not do anything of the kind. He filed his reports. He attended the sessions he was required to attend, standing where he was directed to stand, and did so with the same unremarkable attentiveness he had always had. He learned the forms he needed to know and practiced them in the way he practiced everything, privately, with preparation, so that when he was called upon to perform them, he could do so without calling attention to the learning. The older members of the court understood him better, I think. Counselor Maveth expressed it to me once, in the direct way she expresses everything. He's the same. She said it as though it were a verdict. I believe she meant it as approval. The work was different now. He still managed the records division because someone had to and he was good at it, and he and the Queen had discussed the shape of things going forward in the practical, unadorned way that I gathered they discussed most things directly, with mutual attention to what was real rather than what was hoped. He took on, gradually, the additional responsibilities that his new standing required, with the same patience and preparation he brought to everything else. He learned. He paid attention. He asked questions when he needed to, and listened carefully to the answers. He made mistakes, occasionally, in the navigating of moron court ceremony, and he corrected them without embarrassment and without excess apology, in the manner of someone who understands that mistakes made in good faith and corrected promptly are part of learning and not occasions for display. I watched him in the sessions he attended and found myself doing something I had not done in 41 years of observing court personnel. I found myself revising my estimate of a person upward, not based on a change in them, but based on my own prior failure to look carefully. He had been here for 12 years. He had been, every day of those 12 years, exactly what he appeared to be now: careful, prepared, patient, steady. I had simply not looked. None of us had looked. We had looked past him, the way you look past furniture that is reliably in the right place, and we had missed the thing that was there. I found this instructive and somewhat humbling, and I have been thinking about it since. He learned more of the old Bond tongue. This I know because I was the one he asked for references, one morning about a month after the session, appearing in my office with the same mildly patient manner he always had, and asking whether I had any materials on the old moron ceremonial language that might be suitable for a careful non-specialist reader. I gave him 4 texts. He returned them 3 weeks later with small, careful notations in the margins in his records keeper's handwriting. He gave me no explanation. I did not ask for one. But I thought, looking at the notations, that he had gone back to the 7 words, had found them in the Bond tongue grammar and understood what he had said, had read forward through the ceremonial text to find the responding phrase and understood what she had said. I do not know what that was like for him. I imagine it was a great deal to sit with. He did not bring it up with me, and I did not bring it up with him. But the next time I passed him in the corridor near the records division, he looked up from the document he was reviewing and met my eyes, and held them for a moment with an expression that was steady and clear, and contained something I recognized, though I would have been hard-pressed to describe it precisely. I nodded, he nodded back. That was enough. I am going to tell you the last thing, and then I am going to close this account. It is a small thing, by the standards of what I have described. Smaller than the session, smaller than the bond right, smaller than the registering signatures and the court's reorganization and all of the procedural and political aftermath. It is the smallest thing, and it is the thing I think about most. 3 months after the session, I was in the outer corridor that runs alongside the main hall, the one with the long windows that look over the palace's inner garden, which in the 3rd month is beginning to come into the pale early bloom that precedes the deep summer flowering. I was walking between meetings, carrying nothing important. It was a quiet part of the afternoon, the administrative work largely done, and the formal sessions not yet resumed, the time of day when the palace's senior staff tends to be between things. The Queen and Torvald were standing at one of the windows, not doing anything in particular, standing at the window, looking at the garden. The Queen had a document in one hand that she had apparently been reading before some detail of the garden had caught her attention. Torvald was standing beside her with nothing in his hands, which was unusual for him. They were not talking. They were simply standing there in the pale light of the early 3rd month, looking at the same garden. As I came level with them, the Queen pointed at something in the garden. A particular plant, I thought. One of the early bloom varieties coming up through the border near the stone wall. She said something to him quietly, too quiet for me to hear, and he looked where she was pointing and said something back, equally quiet, and she made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same territory as one, a short exhale of something that lived adjacent to amusement and ease. I kept walking. I did not slow down or make my presence known. I was simply a court advisor walking between meetings in the outer corridor, and what I had passed was simply 2 people standing at a window. But I carried it with me the rest of the day, and I carry it with me still. 41 years of service. 3 succession crises, 2 interregna, 1 coup that lasted 9 hours, a diplomatic siege, the slow decades of an unsealed bond register, and a queen who had learned to hold her grief with steady hands. And then, a man who spent 12 years preparing to pronounce 7 words correctly, in case he was ever asked. And a window, and a garden, and a woman pointing at the first flowers of the season. I think sometimes that the right word for what I witnessed in this hall that day is not coincidence, and is not conspiracy, and is not destiny in the dramatic sense that word usually implies. I think the right word is something quieter than any of those. Something that does not announce itself, but arrives, in its own time, through the ordinary practice of a person paying attention to the thing that is in front of them, and preparing for what might be asked. Torvald Kane did not know he was carrying something. He was, however, exactly the kind of man who could carry it, carefully, without ostentation, for 12 years, and still have it be intact when the moment came to set it down. I have served this court for 41 years. I have not stopped being grateful that I was in the room,